High up on Gortmore in binevenagh, his eternal gaze fixed upon the Magilligan Peninsula, there stands a man. A statue of a man at that. A statue of a god. Manannán Mac Lir is his name, son of the ancient sea god Lir and ruler of the kingdom beyond the waves. Manannán's kingdom stretches far out across the raging waters that surround the Isle of Ireland. His throne was a great island out in the Irish Sea, known today as the Isle of Man, where his name has lived on for centuries. The legacy of this kingdom of man can still be seen today in the island's heraldic arms, which show Manannán's legs careering across the sea in an endless loop for all eternity. It is said that when the island was under threat, Manannán would enshroud it in his magical cloak of mists to protect it from any would-be invaders. These mists also acted as a way of transport to the Otherworld, for Manannán was also the one responsible for ferrying the lost souls of the dead to the afterlife. Manannán had a dazzling array of magical belongings, such as Ianver of the Flowing Mane, a horse that could gallop across both land and sea with no trouble at all. His boat, the Wave Sweeper, obeyed his thoughts and travelled across the sea without the aid of oar or sail. One of his most feared possessions was his sword, Fragarach, the Answerer, a blade so sharp that no armour could protect against it. The very sight of it filled his foes' hearts with fear, and if it was ever held to their throat, they were forced to only speak the truth. Yet even with these otherworldly possessions at his side, Manannán himself was not invincible. He eventually met his match in the Battle of Moy Cullen, where he was slain by the warrior Ullin Ferberderg. His body was buried in the Tonn banks, a wild stretch of water just off Magilligan Point in binevenagh. But here his spirit lives on, riding across the white breakers, his fury summoning mighty storms that have wrecked many a poor ship over the centuries. The Tonn banks are one of the most powerful stretches of water across all of Ireland, and thus are regarded as one of the three great waves of Erin. It is then quite unsurprising, really, that Manannán has been the subject of many stories and legends in Irish mythology over the years. Many of these follow him as he roams across the land, disguised in unassuming attire, intent on tricking and baffling the mortals who he came across on his travels. He kept himself entertained because, after all, even life as the mighty god of the sea, ruler of the kingdom of man, and ferryman of the Otherworld can get a little boring sometimes. One such time was when he journeyed to the halls of Bel Atha Senaig, known today as the town of Ballyshannon in southern Donegal. On that night, its ruler, Aobh Dubh O'Donnell, was holding a glorious feast in his hall. It was one of the most bountiful feasts that anybody there could remember, which was good because O'Donnell's halls were nearly overflowing with people. Hundreds of musicians, cooks, cupbearers, guests, and warriors were all tightly packed together in that grand hall, happily sharing stories and guzzling obscene amounts of mead. So far, the banquet seemed to be plentiful enough, as even when a particularly large and exceptionally drunk warrior stuffed an enormous hunk of meat into his mouth, it was quickly replaced by a somewhat disgruntled servant. O'Donnell had filled his larder with enough food to feed an entire army. He had always boasted about the wealth, power, and hospitality of his domain, and he wanted his great feasts to become famous across Ireland. He had invested heavily in delicately crafted tankards, spectacular decor, and the best musicians that he could find. They were all watched over by the most seasoned warriors of his garrison, just to remind any jealous rivals of his fighting prowess should they try to take some of these goods for themselves. It all made a marvellous display, and so O'Donnell was in great spirits as he watched from atop his gilded dice. Suddenly, the doors to O'Donnell's great hall swung open, and the chilly night air flooded inside, smothering the warmth like a great wet rag. Amidst the downpour of rain, a shadowy, hooded figure could be seen slowly making their way towards the hall. The musicians stopped playing, their joyful music replaced by hushed whispering amongst the anxious guests. They watched as the mysterious stranger strode through the doorway and into the hall, its heavy footsteps echoing off the walls. The figure eventually came to a stop about halfway into the hall, water pooling on the floor around them as it trickled off their drenched clothing. The figure then threw back its great hood, revealing a rather dishevelled but otherwise normal-looking man. Much to the relief of some of O'Donnell's more superstitious guests, whose imaginations were prone to running a little wild at times. A great sleek beard and flowing brown hair hid most of his face, though a pair of beady blue eyes could be seen surveying the room before eventually resting on O'Donnell at the far end of the hall. The stranger had partially drawn the sword that hung loose about his belt, and it seemed to some of the guests that it was emitting some kind of strange, pale light. This is because this was no ordinary blade. This was Fragarach, the Answerer, the mythical sword of Manannán Mac Lir. He smiled at O'Donnell, who met his gaze with suspicion. "Greetings, Chief of Bel Atha Senaig. You need not fear me, for I mean you no harm. I am merely a weary traveller who has come to seek some shelter from the rain. You must forgive me for my appearance. It really is quite a horrendous night out there, you know." But despite his reassurance, the stranger did not release his grip on his sword. O'Donnell noticed this as well, and also decided not to lower his guard. "Greetings, traveller. I must say I was not expecting anyone else tonight, and as you can see, my hall is rather full. Who are you, traveller, and where do you come from?" O'Donnell thought again about the many jealous rivals he had made over the years, and so was a little mistrusting of this stranger, understandably. "Who am I? Why, it's like I told you. A pleasant rambling wanderer am I, and I come from where I am. I've travelled all around the country, meeting with a great many kings and chieftains, and it is yourself that I'm with now, O'Donnell." O'Donnell did not seem to be all that satisfied with this cryptic answer. He was a man of facts, and seeing things for how they were, not silly riddles and confusing mind games. So he asked him again, "Yes, but where do you come from? Whose domain do you belong to?" "Well, nowhere, I suppose. Or everywhere. I live all over the place, you see. Both the land and sea are my home, and they can be found everywhere. So I suppose it depends on how you look at it, really." O'Donnell could see he was getting no further with this frustrating riddler, and instead summoned his gatekeeper. And when the gatekeeper eventually stumbled into the hall and up to the dice, O'Donnell whispered to him, "Did you let this stranger pass through my gates and into my domain?" But the baffled gatekeeper only shrugged and said, No, my chief. I swear, I've never seen this man before in my life." "Well, how else did he get in here then? How is it possible for someone to enter my hall without first passing you at the gate? Huh? Tell me that. I hope you didn't abandon your post, because I thought I made it very clear about how important the feast tonight would be." Of course not, my chief. No, I would never. I haven't left my post all night, I swear it. Well, not until now, but that's only because I was summoned here." But the stranger seemed to hear every single thing that they were saying, despite O'Donnell's best efforts to limit his outrage to a whisper. "Ah, let him off, O'Donnell, for it was as easy for me to come in as it will be for me to go out again." O'Donnell stared at the smiling stranger, completely taken aback by the sheer audacity of this man standing before him. To try to calm this really quite tense atmosphere, O'Donnell's musicians once again took up their instruments one by one and slowly started to play again. This seemed to work quite well, as one by one the awestruck guests resumed their conversations and merriment, trying their absolute best to ignore the dripping, sword-wielding stranger standing there in the middle of the hall. And the stranger himself listened to the music for a little while as well, before eventually exclaiming, "By my word, O'Donnell, there never was a noise of hammers beating on iron that was as bad to listen to as this awful racket that your players are making here." And just like that, there was once again absolute silence in the great hall of Bel Atha Senaig. Everyone was too stunned to speak, unable to think of anything to say. Everyone, that was, except for Chief O'Donnell, who quite frankly could not believe what he was hearing. Who was this insolent fool to barge into his hall without invitation and not only mock his security, but then also insult his musicians. Musicians who were famous throughout Ireland for their playing ability, and one of the primary reasons that so many people had journeyed to O'Donnell's Hall that night. It had become too much for him to bear, and so, finally, O'Donnell lost his temper. "How dare you? Who are you to judge the quality of my musicians? You who have apparently come from nowhere and do not even seem to know your own name. I have grown tired of your disruptions and nonsensical ramblings, and I hereby banish you from Bel Atha Senaig. You are not welcome in my lands, nor in my home, nor in my sight. Be gone!" But of course the stranger did not budge. He only smiled and took up a harp from one of O'Donnell's musicians, and luckily they were far too paralyzed with disbelief to do really all that much about it. And it was then that Manannán began to play a piece of music that was so soft, so tender, and so sweet, that it could surely soothe any baby crying alone in their crib, or gently carry those wounded in battle safely into the deepest, deepest sleep. This is the ancient music of the Sidhe, the Tuatha Dé Danann, who lived deep within the hills, far beneath the feet of those who now walk the Isle of Ireland. O'Donnell's audience was absolutely spellbound, as was O'Donnell himself. In all my years of searching, scouring the land for the most glorious music that this island can muster, I have never, ever heard better music than your own. You are a very sweet player. Manannán smiled. "One day I am sweet, another day I am sour." "Oh, wandering harpist, you must stay and play for me here in Bel Atha Senaig. You will have pride of place here with my other players, as well as anything else that your heart desires. And you may cast off your traveller's cloak, for you will not be needing it anymore. From now on you shall only wear the finest clothing, as befits one of your playing quality. You will become the most famous player in Ireland, for many will travel from far and wide to hear your sweet song being played in my hall." O'Donnell grinned at the harpist, waiting patiently for him to accept his generous offer. Yet, when Manannán did eventually speak, it was not quite what O'Donnell had expected. "They will not, O'Donnell, they will not. For as you say, I am a wanderer. I belong to no one single place, but to all places. Though I do not belong to you, nor any other king or chief for that matter. I would rather be as worn and tattered as I am now, than one who entertains conceited notions from people like you." Once again, O'Donnell could not believe what he was hearing. What sort of fool would turn down as generous an offer as that? So many others would have done anything to have a chance like that, and yet here was this rambling nobody refusing him in front of all of his guests. He would not stand for it. He would not allow this pretentious oaf to insult him in his own home. But still, he tried to calm his fury as best as he could. "I see. It seems as though you are far too skilled a player for the likes of me. Well, perhaps then, if you are so sure of yourself, you may prefer robes that are a bit more in keeping with your appearance then." He had some of his servants bring forth a collection of ruined rags that were somehow even more disheveled than the ones Manannán was already wearing. "I have no intention of letting high-up people like yourself boast about bestowing any sort of gift onto me whatsoever," replied Manannán Mac Lir. This time, O'Donnell was not quite as successful in calming his rage. It was as though a roaring hurricane that had been raging outside had finally blasted through the doors to his hall. He was furious. "You shall not refuse me! No one refuses me! You could have sat at my table as my most esteemed guest. Instead, you will perform for me as my most lowly servant. Warriors of Bel Atha Senaig, I order you to seize this man and bring him to me in chains." And And so every armed warrior drew their weapon and advanced towards the defiant harpist. But despite their greater numbers, many of these warriors were a little wary of this stranger, though they really weren't quite sure why. Could it be that some of them caught a glimpse of that mythical blade, Fragarach the Answerer, as it shimmered in the golden light of O'Donnell's hall? Well, who's to say? The Manannán himself seemed to be very calm under the circumstances. He did not draw his blade any further, even as the warriors drew nearer and nearer. Behind him, Manannán could see 20 armed horsemen and another 20 foot soldiers waiting outside in the rain. And beyond them, he saw at least as many as that lurking behind the gate, seemingly blocking the only escape route out of Bel Atha Senaig. He then turned his head back to the warriors in front of him, who were still keeping their distance for now, and then back to O'Donnell, sitting high up on his dice at the back of the hall. He then asked O'Donnell, with all the calmness of the doldrum waters far out to sea, "What are these men for, then?" O'Donnell scoffed at that, as though really the answer should be pretty obvious. "Why, they are to keep you here, of course." A sudden chill descended upon the room, as did a general feeling of dread amongst those gathered in the hall that night. Some of the guests could have sworn that they saw some kind of blue fire writhing somewhere within the stranger's half-drawn blade. And then Manannán spoke again. "By my word, Aobh Dubh O'Donnell, it is not with you that I will be eating my supper with tomorrow, but at Knock Onion, where Segan, son of the Earl, is in Desmond." O'Donnell did not seem to regard this opinionated harpist as really that much of a threat, although realistically he probably should have. "If I catch you stepping 1 foot outside my hall between now and tomorrow night, I will beat you down into a sorry heap right there on the floor. Do you understand me?" O'Donnell's warriors readied their weapons, waiting for the stranger to make a move. Everyone gathered there in the hall held their breath, peering over one another to see what this madman was going to do. But for now, he just stood there, one hand still clenched around his half-drawn sword, poised to strike at any moment. There was almost complete silence in O'Donnell's hall. And then, inexplicably, Manannán sheathed his weapon. The crowd stared at him, absolutely dumbfounded, as he once again took up the harp and began to play. The melody was just as mesmerizing as before, but this time it had a strange, haunting quality to it. They all watched him as he played, completely enthralled by the tune and unable to take their eyes off him. And when he had finished, he called out to the guards, "Here I am now coming. Watch me well, or you shall easily lose me." He advanced towards the entrance, and the warriors closest to him raised their weapons, ready to cleave him down in his stride. But before they did, they spun away from him and began to strike at each other instead. Terrible screams echoed around the hall as one by one O'Donnell's warriors dropped to the floor in a grisly heap. Utter chaos erupted amongst the crowd as they all shoved into one another to get as far away from this massacre as they possibly could. Limbs flailed, goblets spilled, plates crashed, and O'Donnell despairingly bellowed out to his warriors to stop. But it was no use. Any semblance of order was now long gone, as blood and wine pooled together on that cold, hard floor. Amidst all of this, Manannán was still slowly making his way towards the entrance, completely unhindered. He had a terribly somber look on his face as he walked over the bodies, not even seeming to notice them as he stared ever forwards towards the door. And when he eventually reached the entrance, he turned his gaze to the petrified gatekeeper who was standing there. He reached into his tunic and pulled out a bundle of plants, tied together by a tattered cord. He held them out to the gatekeeper. "Calm yourself. Take these herbs and rub them into the mouths of those who have fallen today. If you do so, tomorrow they will rise up whole and well again. You have my word." The gatekeeper's trembling hands went to take the herb, But Manannán did not let go just yet. "But before you do, ask for 20 cows and 100 acres of free land from your master, as penance for bringing his people back to life." The gatekeeper was shaking terribly, but eventually managed to muster up a fairly convincing nod of the head. Manannán released his grip and then turned away to stride off into the night. The gatekeeper watched him venture out into the storm before he eventually vanished into the gloom, on his way to meet with his next host, and then back to the Otherworld, to the distant lands of the Tuatha Dé Danann.